Colin.
Thank you very much for all that introduction. I just have to share this with you before we start because it lifted my heart and energy no end from an envelope or bag that I got from Holland and Barrett's, which says, "Stand back," it says, "unprovoked jumping for joy in operation." So I thought, well, that's a good start anyway. I'm indebted to a lady who I've never met, who I assume is a member of Michael Van Bruin's lodge. Michael Van Bruin, who's, I think, coming here tomorrow, by the name of Miss Pearl King, BA. And she had taken a topic which runs very close to my topic this morning, relating to the nature of religious experience. She says the function of projection in religious experience. And she starts off, or she doesn't start off, but there's a paragraph here on the second or third page where she says, "Nevertheless, however we explain it, for many people, the Father is replaced by God the Father, and the good loving parents become divine. The great religions of the world have made much use of this image in their exoteric teachings, the Holy Family being the outstanding example. Thus, important experiences from childhood are used as vehicles of an aspect of divinity." Now, I've long since observed that people who have bad childhoods, particularly who have a bad father, find great difficulty in believing in the goodness of God. And it's quite understandable. But the situation develops in a much broader sense. Down through the ages, man has guessed at what God is like. God apparently needed to be placated like an angry parent. And we've seen some terrible things in primitive religion, of the sacrifices of not only animals but of children, to try and placate an angry God. People were scared of a God that they didn't know, but which they think had got it in for them. And when the storms broke and the thunder cracked, and when on other years the crops refused to grow because of lack of rain, they all thought it was their fault because of the way in which they behaved. And a lot of children who are badly treated, of course, think it's their fault when it isn't. The terrible tragedy of the way children are badly treated by bad parents. There were some people, I don't quite know how they managed to get into the position of being witch doctors and so on, who thought that they knew what God was like. They had a concept of God which enabled them to exert power over the rest of their fellow countrymen. And for better or worse, their fellow countrymen had got no way of combating this authority, and so they had to accept it. And again, we've seen that in many other religions, primitive religions. But when it comes to the religion that Theosophy derives its strength from and its origins from, we come, I think, supremely to Plato. And Plato, it seems, I don't think anybody really knows, had access to a great amount of the teaching of the ancient wisdom. That knowledge passed down, as we're told in the Secret Doctrine, passed down from long, long ages ago when man was newly upon the earth and was giving this incredible knowledge, this ancient wisdom, this wisdom which bubbles up occasionally as we go through life. And then probably one of my favourite philosophers, Hermes Trismegistus, comes along. Influenced by Greek thought, influenced by Egyptian thought. Some people call him a Greek, some people call him an Egyptian, because he produced an outstanding penetration of ideas into the nature of God and the nature of existence. And for those of you who are very keen on David John, I've got a leaflet here which we might use if we have time about David John. But he saw, whereas Plato had only seen that there were two aspects to life, the aspect of material life and the aspect of spirit and consciousness, Hermes produced his Hermetic axiom. He saw that within the life that we live, there is a suspicion, a suggestion, almost evidence that the way we live life on this planet in the physical world is somehow reflected in Devachan and the life beyond. More than Devachan, I mean, it goes beyond the last visit we make to Devachan. The whole process of understanding ourselves, our lives, and God is all hinged really on Hermes Trismegistus. He sees and tells us with great conviction and with some degree of authority, just like the old witch doctors, but with got more basis than they ever had, that there's another world beyond this one where much the same patterns are reproduced. Now, if we actually believe that, has a huge impact upon the way in which we view our present life. If we believe that the patterns that we establish in this life are reproduced in the life beyond, has a huge impact. Mind you, we've been subjected in our childhood and perhaps beyond childhood into adulthood to a great deal of confusion. Now, when I was a teenager, I picked up a book off a bookstall like this, which said, "Are the New Testament documents reliable?" It was written by a professor of divinity called H.H. Rowley, who was practicing as a professor in Birmingham University in the middle of the last century. And he examined all the evidence, and very convincingly, for me at that time, he convinced me that the New Testament documents were reliable. We hinge so much of our concepts of God onto the ideas that are projected from the New Testament. Writing again in her article in the Grail magazine, she says, "Now it seems to me that this change is another prototype of the path of spiritual growth. For we have also to discover the reality of a spiritual world that continues and exists independently of our minds and bodies. Independently of our minds and bodies. Only when we are aware of this spiritual reality can we discover the reality of our true self, or the divine principle of man, whatever name we give it." Now, a lot has changed in my lifetime since H.H. Rowley wrote that book The Dead Sea Scrolls have been discovered, the Nag Hammadi texts have been discovered and translated, and all sorts of other ideas have come into play which were not in play in the middle of the last century when I was a student. And so there is a great deal of doubt about whether all the things that Jesus is reported to have said in the New Testament are true. Of course, there's been a long history in the Old Testament of rewriting the scriptures to suit the political climate of the day. And Ezra wrote the present Old Testament in 200 BC, because he felt the form in which he put it was the most advantageous to society. So no one really knows how much of the Old Testament is true and how much of the Old Testament is a construction put upon it by Ezra. However, I think many of us had hoped that the same pattern of behaviour hadn't developed in the New Testament. But perhaps it does. And that's one of the great uncertainties that we have. For example, let's look at some of the things that Jesus said about the concept of God, about the fatherhood of God. He says, if your child asks for bread, would you give him a stone? He asks for fish, would you give him a serpent? He goes on to say, if you know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Heavenly Father give good gifts to those that ask him? And of course it's a thrilling thought. People see it's a wonderful promise. People who believe that God wrote the Bible, I think they're comparatively few these days. I'm certainly not one of them. But the idea that Jesus actually said that was tremendous. And I remember the searing impact upon my mind, which lives with me to this day, when I saw a film many years ago of the Gestapo seizing some Jews who'd been hidden by other people, other German people who were well known in their local society and who were not under suspicion. But someone had leaked the information to the Gestapo. Now, in those days, if you were caught harbouring Jews and protecting them from the state, your fate was to go into the terrible words. I've forgotten what the words are now. But they had these concentration camps. They had these concentration camps, and you were lucky if you actually survived them, because most of them, people who went into those concentration camps, went into the gas chamber. And this woman, as she was caught harbouring these Jews, she cries out, "Jesus, Jesus, help me, help me, help me," she says. And it seared itself into my mind. Surely he'll give good gifts to those that ask him. Where was Jesus? Where was God in that terrible situation where this woman who'd done what she thought was the best out of the love and compassion of her heart was going to pay a huge price for having done it? And you haven't got an answer, have you? If God is all powerful, if he's in charge of the universe that he's made and the lives that he's made, surely he can intervene. So this problem of intervention and whether God can intervene or not is a major problem in the concepts of God. Have we got a concept of God which either allows God to intervene or which explains why he doesn't? Very tricky. Very tricky indeed. I'm sorry, really, but I think for the majority of people who take an interest in religion, that the idea that God is totally in control doesn't stack up. If you want a concept of God, of a God who's in control of what happens to us in human life, it doesn't stack up. Very sad, very unpleasant, very uncomfortable. Stand back. Unprovoked jumping for joy in operation. How can you possibly feel like that in this situation? I mean, really and truly, it's pretty horrible. It's not half as unpleasant as some of the more recent stories. As a story of the Reverend David Watson. I don't know whether any of you have ever heard of him, because it now is at least a couple of decades since this story emerged from a parish up in the northwest of London somewhere. And he was an outstanding parish priest. He really was popular, and people travelled from far and wide to come to hear his sermons and to come under his influence. And he developed cancer. Now, he was a relatively young man. I don't know what he was around about 40 or something, but he was, in my terms, he was very young. And he was dying. So they took this statement about God giving good gifts to those that ask him, and they organised prayer meetings all through the night, all over London, all over the southeast. Prayer was offered in enormous quantities for his recovery. But he persisted with his cancer and died. And for a lot of people, it was a shattering experience. For him to have died was bad enough when he was a good man. But for him to die in the face of this great avalanche, tidal wave of prayer, was even more devastating. Even more devastating, and I don't think that anybody really who has meditated heavily upon the events of Good Friday can escape the spine-chilling call of Jesus on the cross. And the translators of the Bible were so appalled when they came to this statement that they actually put it down in the language that they were translating from, which presumably was Greek. Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? And they passed by and wagged their heads and say, he saved others. He can't save himself. If Jesus is what he claims to be, let God come and save him. I mean, the shattering challenge to the concept of God, that he didn't strike the whole area with great strikes of lightning and thunder and anger at the way in which Jesus was treated. But he did nothing, or so it would seem. So, what use are our concepts of God? What use are they? For centuries, and we sit here looking back on 20-odd centuries of domination by the church. The first few centuries in which the various creeds were constructed to say what Christians ought to believe. And so it's been so easy, and it's even easy in today's world, to not stretch our minds into this chasm of uncertainty and to simply take the authority of the church. And we've reached a stage which I think is an inevitable stage in the development of human history, where people are no longer prepared to believe things just because they're told to. We're looking for some sort of explanation to these terrible events. And so we come along to Theosophy. Now, I think the one thing that really drew me into Theosophy and out of Christian theology more than anything else was to read in the proem to the Secret Doctrine about the One who was omnipotent and who, with all his other characteristics, was beyond the range and reach of human thought. Now, if I really believed that totally, I wouldn't even be daring to give a talk this morning on the concepts of God, would I? Because I'd say that it's a complete waste of time. Any concepts of God that are any use at all are beyond the human mind. Absolutely beyond human imagination or conception. So in a sense, the answer to my posed question for this talk about concepts of God is that we haven't got any. Rather shattering, isn't it? So about all these events that take place where God doesn't appear to be involved, is he capricious? Is he not there? Is he not taking? Is he asleep? You know, all these jibes have been put forward to explain why God doesn't seem to be as involved in human history as we think he ought to be. It's strange that the evidence for the existence of God as an immutable principle is so staring us in the face all the time in nature that we just don't seem to be able to see it, at least not en masse, as a population, as a society. The immutability of the laws of nature reflects exactly the claim in the Secret Doctrine for the immutability of God. In fact, even for the non-believer, the idea that the laws of nature could be so absolutely, totally immutable and unchanging is a staggering concept. Perhaps I should have made my talk the concepts of nature and God, rather than just the mystery or the concept of God. In my work in the research laboratory, I had, in the team that I worked in, I had 2 Roman Catholics, 1 Presbyterian Congregationalist, and another Church of England person like me, all in a team of about a dozen people. There were so many Christians. And they didn't find the incongruity anywhere near as difficult, because when you're up at the research edge of science, all the time you're faced with the reliability of nature. That if you discover a particular facet of nature's laws, that facet will always be there. Whether you look for it now or in 100 years' time, it will be there to the exact, precise precision that it was when you first found it. And to anybody who's looking for some evidence of chaos, it'd be very difficult to find evidence for chaos, because you find a law and it works every time. The candle always lights, always burns in the way that it burns. The laws of electromagnetism, which are comparatively recently discovered in terms of human science, just 200 or 300 years, that's all. The electricity that we've discovered through the laws of electromagnetism dominate our lives. Every single aspect of our lives, from the amplification of my voice and the lights in the room to the refrigerator in which our food is kept, everything responds to this immutability and unchangingness of the laws of nature. And so for those who want to look for evidence of a concept of God that lines up with the secret doctrine, there's plenty of it. The laws in chemistry, the laws in physics, all the laws that have been discovered, the laws of radioactivity which have been developed from Einstein's theories, all these things are absolutely, totally unchanging and immutable. And it takes an awful lot to get beyond that immutability. Now, I've read quite a lot of this book, which Gwyn Hawkins gave away in reasonable quantities at the start of the summer school. I read a lot of it. He tries to explain quite a lot of things with the law of karma. In fact, he takes the death of the innocents. You remember when Herod sent his soldiers to kill the baby boys in Bethlehem because he wanted to destroy the baby Jesus. Hawkins says in his book that the explanation for God not intervening there was because of karma, because all the babies who were killed at that moment in time were in fact predestined to be killed by reasons of things that had happened in past lives. Now, superficially, it sounds quite a good way out, but frankly, I find it forced. I don't find that he hasn't convinced me in this book that every single baby boy under the age of 2 who was killed on that occasion had got it in for him from karmic consequences. So if karma doesn't help us, is there anything that will help us? Well, one of the things that helps, that may help us a little bit, is this introduction of the idea of space. Now, most of us take a fairly pragmatic view of space. We think of space as, can I get another piece of furniture into that room? Is it big enough? You know, can I eat a bit more food? I've got more space in my stomach. You know, there are all sorts of ways in which we imagine space. Is that car big enough for my huge family? The whole idea of space is a very pragmatic and materialistic one. But when we come to the secret doctrine, we find that Blavatsky is telling us that space has a much, much bigger connotation. The word space has a much, much bigger connotation than that. That space is in fact divine. That in fact there isn't space where God isn't. Double negative, but quite useful. There's this wonderful verse. Perhaps I'll read it to you. In Psalm 139. Whither shall I go from thy spirit? Or whither shall I flee from thy presence? If I ascend to heaven, thou art there. If I make my bed in hell, thou art there also. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea, even there thy hand shall lead me, and thy right hand shall hold me. That comes from, I guess, at least 1500 BC. Had somehow some of the ancient wisdom percolated down into the Jewish psyche, and they had seen, the psalmist had seen that aspect of God is that he is everywhere. And I like to put it the other way and say there's nowhere where he isn't. He is everywhere. He is part of the piece, and so it leads us on. That idea leads us on to this staggering idea that HBB brings us of the fact that there's a sort of space which is dimensionless. Now, the one thing we do with space all the time is to get out the tape measure, to measure the length of the drop from the curtain rail down to the ceiling, down to the windowsill or wherever it is we want the curtain to go through. All the time we are measuring space. We are actually concerned with this three-dimensional space. And we're worried all the time about finishing everything that we want to do before it's time to go home. There's this desire to fit everything into the space-time continuum that we find ourselves embedded in. And Blavatsky comes along and says, but there is a sort of space where there is no dimension at all. Your tape measure is totally useless. No good to say, how big is my resurrection body, if you believe in such a thing, because it lives in a sort of realm where there is no dimension at all. Now, even Professor Hawking here is trying to find a subatomic particle or something similar which will explain the spiritual world. And I think there was something in the newspaper a few months ago, wasn't there, about finding the spiritual boson particle or something which would explain the fact that there is a spiritual dimension to life. It is all total nonsense. It is all total nonsense. I'm telling you that dimensionless space is just like the concept of God that we have in Theosophy, totally beyond the reach of our human minds. And so, surreptitiously and inevitably creeps into the situation that we're faced with, this idea of what we believe. Do we believe that there is such a thing as dimensionless space? That somehow, however many universes there are, with different dimensions perhaps to this one, and which occupy space? Do they occupy space? Do they have a different sort of space to the space that we're used to in our three-dimensional world? Where are they? Well, where is dimensionless space? Where do we go when we die? We don't go anywhere because there is nowhere to go. Because dimensionless space doesn't require any space to exist. The ramifications of this line of thinking are huge. They're not only huge and mind-blowing, but they are a huge support to faith in a life beyond this one. Where do I go? I've got a whole sheet that my friend Alan Hughes produced for one of the studies in Worthing Lodge on Devachan. Well, we don't go to Devachan. Devachan is a mind construct, as we all know. But the Mahatmas have got quite a lot to say about it, nevertheless. But our consciousness, if it persists, if it has any immortality attached to it, if it has any prospect of going on when our body dies, is dependent upon this concept that Blavatsky gives us of dimensionless space. It's a fantastic concept. And it's so huge and so vast and so overwhelming in its implications that any attempt to tie it into the physical world and the physical universe is just sheer rubbish, sheer nonsense. There was a man who was very popular in the mid-20th century called C.S. Lewis. He was a broadcaster and a very, very popular lecturer at Oxford University, and again I think at Cambridge as well, because he spent part of his time in one university and part of his time in another. And he wrote a book called Beyond Personality. He examines the whole idea that God the concept of God is to immediately escape the idea that God has a personality. If he has a personality, what's it like? Is he fearsome, as he appears to be sometimes in the Old Testament, and is he sometimes loving? The very next psalm, after the Psalm 22, which Jesus apparently quoted from the cross, which I mentioned earlier, the next psalm is, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." The whole concept is absolutely mind-blowing. Do I believe that somewhere in the realms of the nature of God there is a loving, kind God? Do I believe that? Well, perhaps I do. St. Paul comes along and he constructs his theological explanation of life ultimately in terms of three properties: faith, hope and love, or charity in the original authorized version. And he says the greatest of these is love. Now, one of the concepts of God that has never been refuted, that has been popular down through the centuries as the finest definition you can have of the concept of God, is that God is a God of love. And you look at all the sadness and sorrow and unhappiness in the world, and you're still asked to believe that God is a God of love. That insofar as we reproduce love in our lives, we are reflecting the true image of God. Are we really entitled to stand back? Unprovoked jumping for joy is in operation, because it certainly is, if we believe ultimately that God is a God of love. And St. Paul actually bases the whole of his theology on that basic concept. If it's not true, he says, we are of all men the most miserable. He wasn't miserable. He jumped for joy in spite of all the tribulation and troubles that he had when he was travelling around Asia Minor and up to Rome with the gospel. He was always jumping for joy because he thought he had found the true explanation that lies behind the concept of God. I think I'll stop there. Well, I can ask you, because I've left myself a few minutes spare, I can ask you, anybody who likes to throw a question at me, they're most welcome to do that. Yes, go on.
You mentioned the concept of dimensionless space, which is beyond our imagination. But there is one fairly good example that most people can relate to, and that is a dream. Because in a dream, you can apparently, your consciousness can move around, but the space in which you move around has no dimension relative to the physical world. So here we have perhaps the nearest we can get to the concept.
Yes, but of course a lot of people take their concept of Davidchan in the same category as that, and I quite agree that not only space but time also, because apparently those who've studied dreams say that you can dream a whole long technicolor movie of 90 minutes in a few seconds in your dream. Even time itself begins to lose its vicious hold upon us. It's a fantastic business altogether, because with three-dimensional space you lose time as well. There isn't any guarantee at all that anybody else in the whole universe is interested in Greenwich Mean Time. And yet look how we control our lives with Greenwich Mean Time. the whole subject is so huge and so fantastic that I stand amazed. I stand amazed at the. But the fact is, there is one more thing I wanted to do. I wanted to quote you from The Voice of the Silence, because in the end, the path we choose to live through life may well determine how well we get on in the next life. The Hermetic axiom that as above, so below, as below, so above, it may well apply to us individually in our future existence beyond this earth life. And writing about the two paths, Blavatsky translates these words: search for the paths, but of Olanu, be of clean heart before thou startest on thy journey, before thou takest thy first step. Learn to discern the real from the false, the ever-fleeting from the everlasting. Learn above all to separate head learning from soul wisdom, the eye from the heart doctrine. And just to revert back to something I had intended to say earlier on in my talk about the veracity of the New Testament and how much it's been fiddled with. I think even now nearly all students of the texts and commentators believe that the one thing that Jesus did really say, regardless of everything else, was the Sermon on the Mount. And if you look at the Sermon on the Mount, it is a fantastic series of promises to those who would tread this path. And that's a good place to end. A better place to end than I ended before. My second end.